Welcome to the Filmlings Podcast,
a weekly podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is week 22, Brilliant Biopics.
Yep, and they really are brilliant this week. Three just titanic films by three amazing directors with lots of Oscars between them, covering a wide range of historical figures and in very interesting ways. And
also kind of around the world, too.
Yeah. Wink, wink, hint, hint. Anyway, before we get into the films this week, I just want to give you guys a little preview of what we're talking about when we're talking about biopics. Where did they come from? How long have these things been around? So the first ever film that happened to be about a real person, a person who actually lived, at least as far as we can find, those early days around 1900 were, we lost most of the films from that era. They were not well preserved. The film at that time was highly flammable, tended to go boom, actually, if you weren't careful. So we don't have many left, but we do have a lot of the films that were made by the legendary early filmmaker George Méliès. And he happened to make a film in 1900 called about Joan of Arc, called Jeanne d'Arc, and I know I can't speak French, so forgive me for my pronunciation, but it was the first film that we know of that was about a real person. And in fact, 12 minutes of the 18-minute film still survive. You can go watch them on Wikipedia. It's actually embedded in the article, and you can see what it's like. It's been colored. The film has been colored. It's really interesting, but it wasn't really looking at trying to depict a biography so much as trying to depict a legend. And the first film that was considered to do that, the first film to be considered a true biopic, came a little later in 1929 called Disraeli, about a poet. And I don't know anything about this poet. I just know that the film was considered the first biopic, at least widely by a lot of film scholars. And from there, they've kind of retained some popularity in the film with film audiences over the decades, and we're still making them to this day.
Yeah, I mean, just, what was it, last year, 2 years ago? There were several biopics up for the Oscars. The Imitation Game, which won, if I'm not mistaken, and The King's Speech won in 2010. So biopics are still a strong and healthy genre, and we're going to take a look at, what we get from them, what people like about them, and also where criticism of them comes in, because every biopic that comes out comes with its fair share of criticism.
Right. We're walking that line between fact-telling and dramatic storytelling, and it gets interesting. So what are our biopics this week, Jonathan?
So the first movie that we're talking about is Amadeus from 1984, directed by Milos Forman, and it won 8 Oscars, including Best Picture and Best Actor and a plethora of others. This film kind of depicts the life of Mozart, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, but told by his fictional rival Antonio Salieri.
Who did exist. We just don't think they were actually rivals.
Yeah, the kind of nature of their relationship has been changed to be more exciting for film.
And then we have The Last Emperor from 1987, directed by the famed, legendary, and highly controversial director Bernardo Bertolucci, out of the Italian scene. And it went on to win 9 Oscars. It didn't complete the famed sweep, the Big Five, but it did win 9, and that's incredibly impressive. It covers the story of the last emperor of the Qing dynasty, the last dynasty of China, from his ascension to the throne to his eventual end of life. And that emperor's name was Puyi, and he's a complex character. He's a very interesting character. He's very hard to depict, and they tackle that complexity amazingly well in this film.
Yeah, all of these films handle very complex and pretty dark characters, and we'll get into that. But the last one is bringing it back to America with The Aviator, directed by Martin Scorsese, who's still out and kicking and still making biopics. He did Wolf of Wall Street a couple years ago. But The Aviator won 5 Oscars, the only of our 3 this week to not have won Best Picture, but it's still an incredibly impressive film and a masterpiece by pretty much anyone's standards. And this film is about the life of billionaire playboy movie mogul Howard Hughes, and kind of it takes sort of the height of his career and beginning of his descent into madness, and kind of picks it apart and shows a very interesting time for America and for this one particular individual.
So with that, let's get into that analyzing that we promise every week. And Jonathan, do you want to get us started on our first film, Amadeus?
Absolutely. So this film, and let's just throw out, all these films are 3 hours long, so it's going to be really hard to summarize them without being incredibly general. But like I said before, it starts with Antonio Salieri, who is we start with him having just made a suicide attempt, and he's rushed to this basically mental asylum. We're in the 1800s here, and the whole film is him kind of confessing his life to this priest, because he kind of is under the impression that he quote unquote murdered Mozart. And so throughout the film, we're seeing a lot of flashbacks of his relationship with Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, and kind of how his jealousy at Mozart's talent and genius, whereas he's a composer who's still very good by all accounts, but since he keeps having run-ins with Mozart, he's clearly the inferior in terms of skill, and all he wants to do is, make music. And he has this existential struggle throughout the film, and he can't understand how such a vulgar little man as Mozart is given the talent that he so desperately wants and works so hard for. And that kind of brings it into the themes, which are about creating art and how creative people kind of see themselves in relation to other creative people that they view as greater or lesser than themselves.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting to see these two characters set at odds with each other, because Salieri is, he's very pious, he's very morally rigorous, and like you said, with the vulgar little man Mozart, they actually got that from actual letters that Mozart actually wrote in his real life, where he would run in these societal circles. He'd be, he is a great composer. He was a great composer. He's dead. But these letters that he wrote were incredibly vulgar and incredibly capricious, like you see in the film, like you see him act with that kind of like a troublemaker's mentality and his lack of responsibility and his donkey braying laugh, which is hilarious, by the way. But
yeah, it's a great character choice.
Yeah, you get to see those two characters go at each other, but you also kind of have to question, the lens that we view the story through, because, we're getting it all from Salieri's point of view. Everything is through his lens. It is literally his telling of the story within the film, which is a technique that is used a lot in biopics. We'll see it happens in 2 of our films this week, and definitely in Amadeus, the one we're talking about right now, where the movie begins either in the middle or at the end of the time period covered. So in Amadeus, we start at the very end where Salieri is near death's door. He's attempted suicide, like you said, and he's confessing everything. He is retelling the story. And that is just a technique that's used a lot when we're talking about real life people. I think it's a good way to put the story in some kind of context for people who aren't familiar with the history involved. So it gives you a nice little lens, a nice little jumping off point into a story about the late 1700s Enlightenment Europe and the music scene there, without having to be like a studied person in that area, because you're getting all of that through Salieri's point of view.
Yeah, and I will say just kind of one minor point is that this isn't a kind of rivalry like we saw with The Prestige, where it's two people in the same field who are going at each other necessarily. It's kind of one-sided passive aggressiveness from Salieri's point of view, where he's faking friendship with Mozart through the whole thing and kind of earns his trust in order to betray him in this really dark move, which, like we said, is probably not historically accurate, but it's very interesting from a dramatic perspective.
Yeah, and that's a really good way to set up this tension that is explored thematically throughout the film in this whole genius that is Mozart versus competency, or as he feels himself, mediocrity that is Salieri. Through this rivalry, which, you know, maybe didn't exist, but it's a really great way to set up and explore that tension and see what that difference is between somebody who's really competent in an arena and somebody who is just gifted beyond belief, just completely inspired, like we see Mozart is in this film, where he can write down music completely thought out from top to bottom. He knows everything. Before he even writes it down, he's already written it in his head. It just comes to him.
Right, and one of the really interesting things about the angle of putting it from Salieri's point of view is that we get to hear Salieri praising Mozart, who is his kind of enemy because of his jealousy, but his jealousy doesn't extend to the point of believing himself to be better than Mozart. He knows that Mozart is so much better, and it's so cool to kind of watch him describe the music, and he's kind of the audience who may be less musically trained, and he guides them through almost each piece of music that we see and tells us exactly what the brilliance of it is from the perspective of someone in that field. So that gives the audience an appreciation for the subject that the film is about, which is a really cool move and is a good way to draw your audience into a subject, even if they don't have that high level knowledge of what you're presenting them with.
Yeah, because if you're like me and you're completely tone deaf, you know Mozart is good because people say he's good, and right. You might like his music, but you kind of need an insider's knowledge to really appreciate it. And that's kind of the irony within the world of the film too, because, you know, the king, the emperor, it's Emperor Joseph II of Austria / the Holy Roman Emperor at the time, one of the famous
/ Ferris's high school.
There you go. But he's also he's one of those, you know, super big, super famous enlightened despots of the late 18th century, who was supposed to be all into art. Even him, even his other courtiers, all the other people in the film, of all of them, none of them really truly recognizes the genius of Mozart other than Salieri, which is the irony of it all, because Salieri, while he's the only one to really appreciate Mozart, is also the one constructing his downfall.
Right, and that kind of plays into the fact that Salieri becomes almost an anti-hero for the audience when we see him praising Mozart to the priest at the end of his life after all of these events have taken over. The priest also, who doesn't know anything about music, but he praises Mozart's music, so we know what he's thinking. But then when we're in the flashback, we see him kind of slamming it to the higher-ups, the emperor and all these people, to make it look like they don't like Mozart's music. So that kind of turns us off to the protagonist, which is an interesting move, because, and we'll see that in all three of these, because all three of these do not handle characters who are, you know, Gandhi or Mother Teresa. These are not like completely great people. And so one of the interesting things is to see how the filmmaker can show those darker elements, but still kind of bring us back to a point of sympathy with the character that we're trying to identify with.
And aside from just the writing aspect and the acting, which is beyond brilliant, both the actor who played Salieri and the actor who played Mozart were up for Best Actor, and the guy who played Salieri won. The technique that went into the film itself is just used spectacularly well. The production design is breathtaking. I mean, if you look at late 18th century Europe, it was, especially in like the high society circles, it was a gaudy time. There was,
Right.
fine fabrics, gold encrusted walls, fancy pianos, fancier wigs everywhere. Some people even put pink powder in their wigs, like Mozart, because
Yeah.
he's a bit of a flamingo show off there. But all of that wrapped together kind of heightens the sense of place and the sense of setting within the film and the world that these characters are occupying, and also the grandiose personality of Mozart strutting around with his fancy clothes and his pink wig, and the very somber, reserved clothes of Salieri, who is this moral rigorist. And you see those costume design choices change over the course of the film. You see Mozart get ragged as he starts to spiral down this path to insanity and overworked exhaustion that Salieri's brought him down. And you see Salieri's clothes get darker and darker until like he's wearing almost all black at the very end. But it's also really interesting, besides all that good technique, and this is just a total aside on my part that I find really interesting, that I kept having this thought while I was watching Amadeus. I was like, wow, the late 1700s in Europe kind of looks like the 80s to me. Why does everything kind of look like the 80s?
Big
and then
hair.
it hit me. It was made in 1984. So,
Oh, there you go. Yeah.
so yeah,
I think you're right.
it's hard to remember, but every time you see a historical film, you're seeing an interpretation of that period based on that time. Like, just think about the way the Wild West was depicted in the 1940s and the 1950s versus how it's depicted now. It's much dirtier now, like really, really dirty. Like if you look at something like AMC's like Hell on Wheels or something like that, everyone's covered in grime. Whereas back then it was a little shinier.
Or, I mean, you just take the original 310 to Yuma and the more recent 310 to Yuma, and that's kind of a really good temple of, classic film versus modern film as far as grit.
Exactly.
Or true grit, for that matter.
Or true grit for that matter. But it's also a really good reminder that when you're watching a period film, especially one based on a true story, which all period films kind of more or less are, even if the characters are made up, the time period probably it did happen. You're seeing an interpretation of that. So you're never going to get it 100% accurate because we don't have a time machine. The production designer can't hop in a time machine back to 1790 Vienna and jot down notes and take pictures and stuff. So we're always going to see an interpretation not only of the area but of the characters. Our facts aren't perfect. We don't know everything about Mozart. Even a person in modern times, we can't know everything about a person in modern times. Like if you made a biopic about a recent political figure or a recent celebrity or something like that, you would not have it 100% accurate. So the question when it comes to biopics for me, I feel, is what are we trying to communicate about this individual? How can we do that in a dramatic way? And how can we enjoy an elaborate depiction, a dramatic depiction of some of the facts of this person's life?
Right. And a lot of that even carries over into discussions of documentary when you are trying to portray in an even more factual setting any kind of event, which we could talk about if we get to a week where we're doing documentary, or later when we talk about biopics versus documentaries. But one way that another kind of technical way that these films kind of show these dramatic elements is obviously through the editing and through the cinematography. And the editing in this one, and also music, but this film kind of gets a fast pass on music because they have Mozart's whole library, and so they have some of the greatest music ever composed that they kind of throw throughout the whole movie.
Right, they're kind of starting on the finish line with that one.
Right. In fact, the DVD that I rented actually defaults to the music only version of the soundtrack, and so I put it in and watched for like 5 minutes just hearing Mozart and wondering where the dialogue was. But anyway, a way that's incorporated is, as we talked about all the way back in week 3 with Upstream Color, the use of J cuts and L cuts to fade in and out of Salieri's flashbacks. So he'll start describing a piece of music, and then that piece of music fades in under his description, and then we cut to Mozart conducting it in the actual space. And it was so immersive, especially in this film when it's revolves so much around the music and about feeling the music, and that use of passionate description followed by actually hearing it, followed by actually seeing it being performed was really powerful and really driving force of this movie.
Yeah, it was absolutely beautiful. There's a lot of moments in this film that you can just consider absolutely beautiful, especially whenever Mozart's conducting, especially considering the fact that anytime he's conducting, we're getting this great glimpse into his mental state at the time as he slowly deteriorates. And I think maybe if I was a musical historian, or even just a musician, like a competent musician, I could appreciate that even more. But it is good to know that a layman like me, when it comes to music, can enjoy a film that's this rich in music about one of the best musicians ever to have lived.
And cinematography is the other major way that these dramatic and psychological elements are brought through. Pretty much, I think every composing shot of Mozart are these really grand wide shots from below him with chandeliers and, like you were saying, this garish kind of set dressing behind him. But I think that his size in proportion to the frame kind of changes depending on his mental stability and his mental confidence in his work and stuff like that. And then there's a lot of other elements like color. Salieri is often seen in an opera box that has red wallpaper, and he pretty much every time we see him there, he's looking down on Mozart, just being infuriated at how good he is, and that red really helps accentuate that. And one of my other favorite shots in the movie is this one where Mozart is sick in bed, and we're seeing him over the shoulder of Salieri, who is holding a little candelabra with these flames, but the flames are right in front of Mozart, like right by the camera. And so it's almost like Mozart is on fire, and you can see him sweating with this fever. And it's just a perfect illustration of Mozart's mental state of mind and his physical illness. So all of these films have really great cinematography that we'll talk about. But those are some of the things that really stood out to me about this movie.
Something we're going to have to talk about with each of these biopics this week is this discussion, this balance between historical accuracy, factual accuracy, and the dramatic license that was taken in the telling of the story. And especially with Amadeus, I feel like Amadeus is the biggest violator of this. And maybe I'm just saying that because I found so many articles with historians or musicians decrying the factual inaccuracy of this movie, saying it was basically unwatchable because it was so wrong. Which, by the way, it isn't. It is completely watchable because it's not a documentary. And I don't think the point of this film was to accurately depict Mozart's life so much as it was to try to convey this singular truth that the filmmaker thought, at least, that Mozart was a truly exceptional, truly genius, truly remarkable musician. And if you take nothing else away from the film, if you don't dive into the character complexity or the balance or the moral problems of Salieri, then you definitely come away with the impression that Mozart was just amazing. He was just truly a kick-ass musician, really, really talented. And I think that was the point of the film, to really just leave you with that. And it wasn't always a film. First, it was a play, then an opera, I think. But the movie that you see is more based on that play and that opera. And of course, the filmmakers went back and researched Mozart himself and took what they thought would help tell the story and convey this message from his life and put it in the film. But it's always been a dramatic story that they were trying to tell. It was never a documentary. It's not like Hamilton the musical that was based off an actual biography. This is just a dramatic biopic.
Yeah, and so let's transition that into a story about a character or a person who maybe has more interest because of the situation he found himself in than maybe what he was able to bring to it. And let's talk about The Last Emperor from 1987.
So The Last Emperor of China, the film, is about the last emperor of China, the person, obviously. His name was Pu Yi, and the film itself covers the period of the early 20th century and documents the person itself as much as the course of China's history over the first part of the 20th century. From its transition from a dynastic monarchy system to warlords to temporarily a republic to the rise of communism and Mao Zedong, and ends up ending around the time of the Cultural Revolution in the 60s or 70s. It also spends a lot of time detailing the events around World War II. Probably most of the film starts around World War II or takes place around World War II. In fact, it starts there. It starts in medias res as Pu Yi himself has been captured by the communists after trying to flee to Russia. And he is caught in the bathroom of the prison station before being transferred to the larger prison, attempting suicide. Another parallel to Amadeus there. It seems to be a pretty common theme between at least these two biopics, if you could call that a theme. But it does give us another chance to start another biopic by framing the story. And instead of that being the end of the story, it ends up being half the story. The story of Pu Yi is told both from the start in World War II, after being captured by the Chinese Communist Party, but also from his ascension in 1908 to the throne of China and being coronated as the last emperor of China. And then it tracks along both of those storylines moving forward, cutting back and forth, creating significance by showing it in certain points, revealing different parts of his personality and his situation as the story moves along. But really, you could probably sum this up by saying it's the story of kind of an unremarkable person stuck in these super extraordinary circumstances.
Right, and kind of what that kind of an upbringing, which is it's like faux power plus this weird incarceration in which you kind of have everything that you would want within these walls, but the fact that you're stuck within walls makes you want to get outside of them, and what that does to him when he gets out of the walls. So it's really interesting character study, which is what all of these are. So it definitely lends itself to the genre that we're talking about.
Yeah, he's a really, really complex character who's just chock full of contradictions, both in his situation and in his personality. And there's this constant question of whether or not he's likable over the course of the film. Normally, whether or not a character is likable doesn't change too much over the course of the film. Except in this case, I feel like the audience is being played with almost as we move from a likable Pu Yi to an unlikable Pu Yi to a sympathetic Pu Yi over the course of the film.
Right, because we kind of start with him when he became emperor at 3 or 4, and he's completely adorable. So we get to see him kind of playing, and he's kind of the boss, but he's 3, so he doesn't know what he's doing. And then as he grows up, and for lack of a better word, becomes a spoiled brat, and then through the time when he gets arrested and is trying to learn, he kind of wants to be this revolutionary figurehead, but also is too accustomed to his life of having servants and all this kind of stuff, to the point where he kind of reconciles that. But it's kind of, I feel like most of the film spent time in that portion of his life where he was a spoiled brat and kind of facing resistance to that in the outside world. And so since we spend so much time there, it's hard to look back on it with a sympathetic view of his character, which, whether that's that's obviously we see it, that character traits being developed just by nature of his situation. But, that's kind of the questions that the film brings up.
Right. And they do a really good job of setting up Pu Yi as a sympathetic character, as a likable character at the very beginning. Because the first 2 things we see are him being captured by the communists and trying to attempt suicide to escape his fate. And then we see him fleeing for his life, fleeing to the Forbidden Palace, and they're being coordinated. So we put those 2 together, and we see that this is a kid who's been tossed into circumstances and then has grown up and looked like he's been tossed into even worse circumstances with the communists. But over the course of the film, like you said, you get that character development, and you see him develop to be a spoiled brat and to be, I don't want to say dumb, but maybe not so smart, maybe not so perceptive, because he's been told yes all of his life, but he's also been kept under control all of his life. And it's kind of hard to become an actualized adult, a self-sufficient adult under those circumstances. And we see him struggle with that, and we see all the people around him who've influenced him. But that jumping back and forth is a really smart way to tell the story. It's a really clever way to do basically just juxtaposition, to work with the idea of montage, and to juxtapose 2 things to create a newer meaning. So we can put together the first 2 scenes and feel sympathetic for Pu Yi. And then we see the next few scenes and we feel like Pu Yi is becoming a spoiled brat. And then later on we see that he's in over his head, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and it's all about, the sequence in which information is revealed, because at the beginning we're seeing him grown up, and later on we realize that this is in his spoiled brat phase, but we don't know anything about his character. It's like the first shot of the film. So we don't know anything about him, and then we see him as a kid, and we still don't really know that much about him. We don't know what he will grow to become. So, like you're saying, it's that revealing of information. And if we want to jump into technique, another way that the film kind of shows the different stages of Pu Yi's character is through the color. And this kind of accentuates both his character and the social and political climate of China in whatever time period we're in. So anytime we're in the prison that he's being kept at, it is almost entirely desaturated. It's a lot of grays. Everyone is wearing gray. The walls are gray. And just like maybe little speckles of color, like, the blood flowing out of his wrists in one of the most striking shots in the movie, which comes within the first 5 minutes. And then in the flashbacks, we're in the Forbidden City in China, and we're seeing kind of the height of Chinese artistry and architecture, and of course the most, again, garish, because we're in maybe the most important city in the whole country. So there's a lot of reds, a lot of very saturated dyes in the fabrics and everything going on. And the different colors that he's surrounded with definitely kind of give an accent to his emotional situation as we go through the movie.
Right. And even when about the midpoint of the timeline, when Pu Yi goes to Manchuria to become essentially a puppet ruler of a puppet kingdom of the Japanese, All the time spent there has this very cooled off teal cyan vibe to it, and you can feel the slide between those three stages. And then at the very end of the timeline, around the time of Mao's Cultural Revolution, almost the last 2 or 3 scenes of the film that take place there, we get this flush of red flowing right back onto the screen, where we see red everywhere and everything is brightly colored. And then we end back in the Forbidden Palace. I won't spoil the circumstances of that, but they're back in the Forbidden Palace with all these golds and reds and all these bright colors.
Golden sunset kind of tint to it, which actually kind of plays into one of the elements of the movie, which is a character named RJ, played by Peter Toole, who comes as Puyi's growing up and kind of tutors him, and he's obviously a Westerner who kind of gives him an education about the world outside of China, since he's stuck in his little palace. But after the tutoring and everything, RJ goes back to England and writes a book called Twilight in the Forbidden City, and that's kind of the image that we end on to tie everything back together, which is really neat.
Right. And that book, Twilight in the Forbidden City, was the inspiration for this film itself. So this film is actually working off of a first-hand source, a historical document. And so I don't think we've heard as much griping about historical accuracy in this one. I mean, obviously they've taken license with a lot of things. A lot of the very personal, intimate moments are obviously completely made up, complete speculation. But it creates, again, you're taking that dramatic license to create a really powerful film that's communicating this unremarkable person's struggle of being within these remarkable circumstances, and kind of his realization that he's not remarkable, because definitely when he's little, he has this mentality of being, I'm the emperor, I can do anything I want. I must be remarkable, I must be great. And then towards the end of his life, he obviously realizes that's not true. He gets the ground taken out from underneath him. He gets kicked out of the Forbidden Palace. He gets captured by the Communist Party. He gets thrown in a jail for a long, long time. Right. And over the course of that, he kind of learns and grows and shifts.
But that's a very slow transition. And I think it could be a little frustrating because, again, this is another 3-hour movie practically. And so watching a character kind of very snailishly work himself into a redeemable character can be a little taxing and frustrating on the audience's emotions. And I'm kind of wondering, because you brought up sort of some of the reception of this film, that there's not a lot of talk about the historical accuracy, but there is a lot of discussion about just how beautiful the film is, how great the locations are. They actually filmed in the Forbidden City, and a lot of the Chinese locations were real. And so it almost has this touristy aspect to it, this exotic allure of us being able to take a peek into this environment that we would never be able to experience in our lifetimes, and especially this culture that will never exist again in the way that it did in the Forbidden City. And I almost wonder, what, if you put on the scales the character development versus the cultural interest, does the fact that it's just really interesting to get that almost paparazzi-like look into the life of this individual of a status that we can't even imagine nowadays, trump the fact that this person is not the most likable person? And does that affect how we end the film, that we have to kind of end it on a sympathetic light for the character?
I think so. I think yes, it does. I don't fall into the camp of people who think that the protagonist has to be fundamentally likable. I think you can have a lot of fun rooting against the protagonist, but I don't think you do that with Puyi. I think you're always rooting for him to change, or to want to change, or to overcome his circumstances and become a better person. And you're right that touristy aspect of the film is part of the spectacle, especially considering that this was the first film shot in China since the rise of the Communist Party under Mao Zedong. It was a really big deal at the time that they let Bertolucci in to film there, that they let them into the Forbidden City itself to film there. So that's definitely super fascinating. And you're right, that definitely falls under the category of being a tourist film because of those facts.
It's almost voyeuristic at some points in a way.
Yeah, almost. I don't want to say exploitational in its depiction of China. It doesn't wallow in that, but
right.
It does get a big boost from the fact that, or from the exoticness of the setting compared to the audiences who viewed it, and I think that's part of what makes it so exciting to watch, even today.
Yeah, and I think if nothing else, it helps keep you engaged. Because we are rooting for Puyi, but again, it's such a long movie that we can't root for him forever. But I think that those elements of interest, culturally, kind of whet our appetite and keep us engaged throughout the whole 3 hours.
For sure. And, it definitely, played well in Hollywood, won 9 Oscars. So
absolutely.
Depending on how much stock you put into Oscars, or actually, let me take that back. Putting stock into winning 1 Oscar is something, but at the point where you win 9 Oscars, you have something incredible on your hands. Like, that's a legendary film. And I feel like The Last Emperor definitely falls into that category.
Right. And legendary films and legendary people are what this week is all about.
Right. So with that, let's take it back home. Let's take it back to Hollywood with a famous person in Hollywood himself during his day and age, Howard Hughes, in The Aviator 2004. Do you want to talk about that one, Jonathan?
Yeah. So The Aviator is about American Howard Hughes, who lived in the early 1900s. He was kind of a tycoon of the aviation business, obviously, hence the title. He pioneered a lot of innovations within aircraft during World War II, and he was also a movie mogul who produced several films such as Hell's Angels and The Outlaw and the original Scarface. And his life was full of very strange twists and turns as far as not only all of his different ventures that he was involved in, but also just his mental stability and how that plays into him as a public figure with his eventual, basically, descent into insanity. And this film doesn't quite get into the end of his life, but it covers kind of his golden age from the 20s through the 40s or 50s. And his start of mental descent, and also just his personal life and ventures.
Right. Howard Hughes was famous for being a playboy in Hollywood. He was famous for being really rich and throwing tons of money at anything he wanted to. He was obsessed with movies. He was obsessed especially with airplanes. And he did develop mental problems later in his life. A lot of it had to do with his extreme hypochondria. He had extreme OCD, and he had a disorder of the nervous system that caused a lot of very normal sensations to be incredibly painful to him. So later in the film, where we see him sitting around naked, a lot of that has to do with the fact that wearing clothes was incredibly painful. Later in his life, he would go years at a time without cutting his fingernails or shaving or things like that, just because they were too painful for him to handle. And we do see that descent into madness starting and continuing throughout the film. But I don't think it's the main thread of the film. It's kind of his Achilles heel that threatens him over the course of his life. But the bigger question is, or the bigger point, the bigger interest in the film is watching him trying to succeed at what he wants to succeed at being the best really rich guy he can be. And trying to accomplish all he wants to accomplish. And you get to see that driving almost obsession with the things he wants to do. Like how he
Definite
shoots an
obsession.
entire film at the beginning. In the movie, he shoots an entire film, Hell's Angels, which is an actual movie. You can watch it on archive.com for free. But he shot it entirely for silent film. And then sound film came out. The technology became popular while they were shooting that film. And he decided they wanted to reshoot it. So he did. And he threw all the money at it. And eventually it becomes a success. And you see the same kind of story repeat itself over the course of the film. And you see that almost foreshadow his descent into madness with these obsessions.
Right. And that, carries over into, I think his entire life can probably fall under the category of obsessive. Like you mentioned that he literally had obsessive compulsive disorder, but I think that the interesting thing in this film is that it traces that obsessive tendency, which we could probably call his tragic flaw, through every part of his life. The fact that he taps his girlfriend's rooms with, literally a dozen bugs, and the fact that he will keep sending airplanes back to the point where he wanted the bolts that were holding the plane together to be what's it called?
Completely flush.
Yeah, completely flush, basically like inverted, so that there was no wind resistance, even from little nuts sticking off of the airplanes. And he would order tons of gigantic airplanes before he even knew if they would fly, just with his own money, because he was so obsessed with getting it right. And that all kind of culminates in the court case that is at the end, where all of these tragic flaws are brought to the forefront, but also some of his redeeming qualities and the fact that he still had enough kind of reason in his brain to win this court case against Pan Am.
Yeah, and that was a Supreme Court hearing. They were trying to pass it was essentially a witch hunt. The guy who played by Alec Baldwin, the guy who in charge of Pan Am, was trying to sink Howard Hughes' flight company, his commercial flight company. And he was doing that by having the senator who was in his pocket go after Hughes. And Hughes just rips the senator apart in court. It's absolutely enjoyable to right. watch. And especially because the senator is played by Alan Alda, and he's always great.
Yeah, the cast in this movie is fantastic.
It is. It really is. You have Cate Blanchett as Katharine Hepburn, the best Hepburn.
Ian Holm, you have John C. Reilly, you have Adam friggin' Scott, and even Willem Dafoe shows up, and it's just kind of star-studded all throughout this movie. People coming in for different little points of Howard Hughes' life, but they're all incredible actors.
Right. And when you're Scorsese directing a film, you have that pull to get actors into your film, even for small bit parts, like Jude Law playing Errol Finn for 2 scenes.
I didn't even realize that.
Yeah, he's in there. But when we look at Howard Hughes' mental state, and also at the story, kind of the background story, the setting story, if you will, of the story of Hollywood and the changes in Hollywood over the course of the 2 decades that this film covers, we're looking at the way that's conveyed in the cinematography and the color and other techniques. And Scorsese goes really bold with the color, I think. He uses... Okay, so his plan was, and it turned out that way, that he was supposed to use the color technique for each year that the film was set in. So for 1929, he used, or he made the film, The Aviator, look like the two-color Technicolor process from 1929, which is kind of like that pink and cyan look that you see on the film.
It's really interesting.
And then you see it even out a little bit more over the course of the film. But you can still notice it as it goes on and on, like the faces look maybe a bit too orange in the court case scene, and so on and so forth. But you can see that technology improve as well as the stature of Hollywood improve. But you also see it intensify as Howard Hughes's mental state goes slowly down the drain. Like when he's hiding out in the screening room for 4 months, which actually did happen. Right. And you're drowned in these bright reds and bright greens of the lights within the room. And the editing is choppy and intense as he's just going all over the place.
Right. I think the editing kind of stood out to me the most as far as the technique in this film, because it's almost, but not quite, like an Edgar Wright style of montage at certain points, because it's not like really fast and stylized. It's more to convey Hughes's mental state, where in the middle of a conversation that he becomes incredibly uncomfortable in, or this social situation, it'll start cutting to little random close-ups, or if he's getting kind of just ambushed by the paparazzi and there's light bulbs. The use of the flash bulbs from the 20s was pretty brilliant in this film, because back in those days you would have a camera that would literally just have a bulb on it that would ignite when the shutter was clicked and literally burst the bulb, so it's the brightest that you can possibly make it. And they use that to overexpose the image to the point where at several points only the iris of people's eyes were lit up, and is really haunting. And then once that's established at the beginning, they actually come back to that effect later on. Even if paparazzi aren't present, it will just flush the frame with white, just to show how I guess neurotic that Howard Hughes is becoming at that point, and how just overstimulated his brain is, and it's really interesting.
Right. And I think with this film, the story of him being crazy is true. It was very true. He was a very troubled person with a lot of problems, but the way it was depicted was very dramatic.
And almost sympathetic.
And incredibly sympathetic.
Right.
He definitely had a lot of flaws. You see him basically hire personal prostitutes across the film, many of whom I'm pretty sure were underage. Not sure what the laws were at that time.
They almost make that explicit in the movie.
Yeah. I think I maybe just hoped they weren't underage, but I cannot bend reality. So,
all right, this is one of those facts that were not changed for the film.
Right. So, and we see that maybe he's not great with money, even though he keeps winning in the end. And we definitely see that he's crazy, but we also see that he cares about what he cares about, whether that's a person or trying to succeed in the film industry or trying to succeed in the plane industry. We never see him backstab anybody or anything like that. So we're left with a very sympathetic character who we can kind of just blame his faults on his craziness to a certain extent. And whether or not that's fair or whether or not that's just, I don't know. But that is definitely kind of this character study that is The Aviator.
Right. And, that's, again, going into this idea that a very complex, a very flawed character sometimes makes the most interesting story because you almost want to root for someone who's in a really low place because you're hoping that someone is going to root for you if you're ever in a similarly low place.
Right. And that's that's one of the reasons that films stick with us, is that we sympathize with them on a personal level. So when we've talked about the discussion between accuracy and dramatic license in both of the films previous to this one, and we should talk about it with The Aviator. If you look on IMDb for The Aviator, it is chock full of trivia, air quotes on trivia, comments about slight inaccuracies here and there throughout the film. And I'm sure even the color processes aren't exactly correct because trust me.
Well, they can't be, yeah.
They can't be. Scorsese did not shoot this on 35mm 2-color Technicolor.
We should note that those film processes are literally extinct. Like, there's no one nowadays who knows exactly how that process or has the technology to recreate it exactly as it was.
Right. I mean, the film of the 80s and the 90s is barely hanging on. So
right.
The 30s and 40s, that color technique is gone. But obviously he took some dramatic license with how he wanted to represent it. He wanted to make it look like it, but he also added a lot more contrast than you see in those earlier films. You see a lot more modern lighting techniques. So obviously it wasn't set up to be a complete 100% accurate depiction. It was not meant to be a documentary. And it did take dramatic licenses. Obviously, enough people on the internet complained about it, which happens all the time. But I don't think that takes away from it being a good movie. I think we still get the story that was meant to be told about Howard Hughes and his struggle between success and his internal torture. And I don't think those little nitpicky inaccuracies take away from the film at all.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting things as far as the dramatic portrayal of this film, especially with compared to our other two, is that this is the only film we looked at this week that does not have that extra buffer of it being told by someone within the film. It is purely Martin Scorsese telling us this story. There's no extra semi-Rashomon effect of a character telling their own version of a story. We are just given these events and kind of asked to interpret them as we will. And, talking about, as long as we're kind of getting into comparing all three films, let's jump into overall notes and talk about the different ways that we tell stories that are factual to one extent or another through different artistic mediums. Because I think film has a very special place as far as telling true stories of people from a fictional angle that doesn't exist in the same way in any other medium, I feel like.
Right, because when you're looking at telling real life stories in a dramatic way, how do you do that in a painting where you can only capture a moment? How do you do that in a photograph where you can only capture a moment? In a book, you can kind of do the same thing where you can dramatize a story or you can write a biography. Obviously, there's documentary filmmaking, which is an attempt at cinema verite, if there is such a thing, which I don't think there truly is. But when you're looking at a biopic, you're looking at someone trying to convey the essence of a life rather than the facts of a life. And I think that's a really powerful thing to look at.
Yeah, and I think that it's a special thing about film is that we have the two categories, one being documentary and one being biopic. In a documentary, you're kind of called to present factual information as true to life as possible is much more stringent than in a biopic. You have a lot more leeway to, handle use a person's life to handle bigger themes, I think. Especially like if we take Amadeus, the film is trying to convey the feeling of an artist who knows that he's not the best, and how do you cope with that, and how do you become okay with yourself as an artist, knowing that there's someone, especially in such close proximity, who will always be better than you. And it just uses Mozart as a vehicle to express that theme. Whereas in a documentary, you can find plenty of documentaries about Mozart's life and the factual, what we know and don't know about Mozart, but you won't get that same thematic takeaway from a more factual presentation.
Right. And I think that's what bugs me about people saying that films are ruined because they don't match historical accuracies to the last detail. Which
the History Channel is full of those. Go watch those.
It used to be. Now it's all just swamp people.
Well,
but that's a different discussion for a different podcast. But I feel like as long as that central truth, whatever you're trying to convey, as long as you know what you're trying to convey, I guess, and then you do a good job, you do a very powerful job of conveying that, like Amadeus, like The Last Emperor, like The Aviator, then you have something good on your hands. But, if you fudge all the facts and you do a bad job of making the movie and your message is all over the point, obviously it's going to suck. But that's not what we're talking about this week. We're talking about not just biopics, but brilliant biopics, really good biopics, the ones that win 8 or 9 Oscars, or 5 if you're The Aviator. Tough crowd.
Or
but,
Aviator.
But still, that's the point. That's the power of these films, is that central point, that central tenet, that central fact, whatever they're trying to convey about these people and their lives, and then the quality, fantastic filmmaking to back it up and to just launch it into your face in a spectacular way.
Yeah, and I think that, the discussion might be a little bit different if there were some element of slander. Like if you're making a biopic and then totally slandering your subject and making really outrageous and defamatory claims about them, there is a little bit more like excuse for calling it out. But that's not even what we're looking about here. But I did just want to kind of qualify that at some point there might be room for that discussion. But I think as long as the subject matter is handled tastefully and with a degree of factuality, because there does have to be some level of factuality, and all we're talking about this week is kind of those varying degrees to one extent or another, then you have a lot of leeway in biopics to present your thematic material.
Right. Because there's a line between a biopic and alternate history films, like or even just material like TV too, especially the big one right now, I think, is The Man in the High Castle, which is what if history went a different way? And that's just totally messing with the facts. And that's not what we're talking about this week. We're just talking about biopics. So I think the big takeaways for this week is that a biopic should be striving for a type of accuracy in theme or a singular truth about a person rather than overall accuracy, like a biography or a documentary. So, for instance, Mozart's exceptionalism and the tension between genius and mediocrity when it comes to creatives. Puyi's complex position between being likable or unlikable, between being powerful and just being a puppet. Or whether or not it's Hughes's madness mixed with all of his success, and how do those the tension between those two play out to create this really sympathetic, if not all good, character.
So let's talk about next week, and we're back with more Kurosawa. Actually, the last one for a while, at least. And we're going to not be putting samurai and adapting it to the Wild West, but this time we are taking samurai to space, and we are going to look at Akira Kurosawa's 1958 film, The Hidden Fortress, and the world-renowned 1977 George Lucas hit blockbuster Star Wars. And we will be watching the theatrical release, sometimes called the despecialized version, which, if you can find it, go ahead and watch that. Otherwise, watch your defamed DVD or Blu-ray version.
It should be exciting. It should be a fun cap on this kind of mini series we've got going, comparing Kurosawa to Kurosawa influenced or Kurosawa inspired or Kurosawa remakes. And we might be doing another series pretty soon. Something a little bigger, maybe a little bigger. It's still in the works, but we'll let you know.
Yeah. So, get your pocket translator and hold on to your butts.
Yeah, I hope you guys have passports. What was that? Anyway, that's about all the time we have for this episode.
If you have movie suggestions for us or just want to reach out, I can be found on Twitter at @JSSatchel.
And I'm at Alex Geringer.
And to find links to things that we talked about today, you can view them on the blog at thefilmlings.wordpress.com.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people will know what we're all about.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next week.
All right, see ya.
Samurai in Space.